Okay, so in the previous videos we have been finding these trig functions such as secant and tangent using a triangle. Well, I wanted to review again that we don't necessarily need to use a triangle. You can also use trig identities, and there will be times where that is a better option, and then of course there are situations like this where the problem tells you you have to use trig identities. So let theta be an angle in quadrant 3 such that the sine of theta equals a negative 5 over 13. Use trig identities to find the secant of theta and the tangent of theta. So no matter how much you want to draw a triangle to solve this, you do have to use trig identities in order to get these problems. Okay, now when you're using trig identities, usually, if you can, one of the better strategies is to first figure out sine and cosine. Because if you have sine and cosine, then you can figure out all other trig functions. Now we're given sine, so we need cosine. So to do cosine, we're going to use our Pythagorean identity. The sine squared of theta plus the cosine squared of theta equals 1. Okay, well, we know sine of theta is a negative 5 over 13, so we're going to put in a negative 5 over 13 squared plus the cosine squared of theta equals 1. Okay, let's square that out. So 5 squared is 25 over 169 plus the cosine squared of theta equals 1. So cosine squared of theta is 1 minus 25 over 169. So cosine squared of theta is, so what's 169 minus 5? That's 144 over 169. And then we take the square root of both sides, and the cosine of theta is going to be plus or minus 12 over 13. Easy enough. Now we have to determine, well, is it positive 12 over 13 or negative 12 over 13? And it tells us that it's in quadrant 3. And we know in quadrant 3 cosine is negative. So in quadrant 3, the cosine is negative. So we end up with the cosine is a negative 12 over 13. Okay, so now that we know that the sine of theta is a negative 5 over 13 and the cosine of theta is a negative 12 over 13, we can figure everything else. Now we know the secant of theta is 1 over the cosine of theta. So that's 1 over a negative 12 over 13, which is a negative 13 over 12. Easy enough. The tangent of theta, well, we know that identity. That's the sine of theta over the cosine of theta, which is a negative 5 over 13 divided by a negative 12 over 13. And so that becomes a negative 5 over 13 times a negative 13 over 12. And so that becomes 5 over 12. And so we can finally answer the secant of theta is a negative 13 over 12. And the tangent of theta is 5 over 12. Put a nice little box around that. Okay, so another good problem using trig identities to find trig functions. Again, the key to this is if it tells you to use a trig identity, no matter how much you want to, don't draw a triangle. That is wrong. Even if you come up with the correct answer, it's not correct. So don't put yourself into that situation. Use the trig identities.